Today's talk is being given by David Jenkins. David is married to Gaynor. They have 3 children and 3 grandchildren. David has been a pastor of a Baptist church and an Anglican priest and chair of, I'm not sure whether this is PONTS or PONTS, their operation committee, and they're a Welsh NGO working in Uganda. David's a professor emeritus in land studies at the University of South Wales, although he tells me that if you look that up on the internet at the moment, the website is under construction and you are likely to find a lot of gobbledygook, but perhaps a picture of David. David's got degrees in land management, applied AI and theology. And so over to you, David.
Yes, thanks, Melanie. And good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm really enjoying these Saturday sessions, and I hope this one is as enjoyable for you as it's going to be for me. I'm going to start with a prayer, if I might, a short prayer based on some writing of Kaj Monk, a priest who was murdered by the Gestapo in 1944. Lord, help us to change human history until it conforms to the norms of your kingdom. Amen. And I'm going to share with you some slides. I like to use presentations. So if you give me a moment just to set that up. That should be with you now. So I have this long-held conviction that, and it becomes a working hypothesis for this talk, that our civilization is edging towards collapse. And that the dislocation that we've seen caused by COVID-19, as well as being a human tragedy, is a witness to structural weaknesses in late capitalism. Now, as with any intuition, I need to open that up to persuasion. I don't think we should be dividing into camps on this issue, but it does invite conversation. In fact, all I want to do this morning is invite to some conversations. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to do this. Prompted by the Spirit, I've been in Ezra for the last couple of months. And what I want to do is use my readings to draw a parallel between the current collapse in global systems and the fall of Jerusalem and its aftermath. And then more specifically, I want to talk from a faith perspective about the rebuilding of Israel post-exile and implications for rebuilding our own society. The teacher tells us that there is a time to tear down and a time to build up. And I'm committed to the current tearing down in society, but I also want to explore the dynamic relationship with rebuilding. So at the outset, I want to assert 2 things. First, that psychologically, we are co-creators with God. So building up comes more naturally to us than tearing down. And that while the people of God are not immune from social collapse, God is with us always, in and through the collapse, in all the outcomes, and in any subsequent rebuildings. So I want to stress the provisional and tentative nature of this session. There will be more questions raised than answers. And if you think my intro is a bit long-winded, apologies. Wait till you see the handout, which I will post later on chat. Oh, it took 3 goes to get to the next slide then. I hope that's not going to happen repeatedly. How should we as rebels read the Bible? Vanessa sort of suggested in her discussion on the age of utility that the prevailing culture is deep in our bones. And for church particularly, the antecedents of that culture arise from the 4th century compromise of a burgeoning Christianity with a fading yet militarily still powerful Roman Empire. And I want to recommend this series of books on Christendom. I don't know if you've come across After Workshop, Advanced Workshop, and the Workshop series, but these books came out of that stable. They are Anabaptist, Peace Church, Anglican authors. Yeah, the state religion, whether of Imperial Rome or the modern Church of England or the Temple of Ezra, offers possibilities of, on the one hand, incorporation into the state, and at the same time, possibilities of freedom and renewal of the spirit. So not to worry if yours is not a state religion, because this analysis applies in large part to all denominations. But I see our job as identifying the tensions inherent in the world that we confront and developing tactics and strategy to obtain our shared goals. So for me, what we need is a dialectical understanding. And in order to do that, I think we need to read with a creation spirituality. Some of you will know the work of Matthew Fox, and I could mention Norman Habel's work, Moving Beyond Anthropocentrism. A sense here for me of catching the wave of the spirit of Faithbridge. We need to read between the lines, and who better to help us than Paul Ricoeur, who calls for us to be suspicious and asks us to subvert really the baggage of traditional readings. We need to read with the mind of the rebel Christ, and Martin's already introduced us to John Deere. We could mention Shane Claiborne and many others as examples. In theological terms, what I'd say is we need to develop a rebel hermeneutic, one that puts the poorest and marginalized front and center. And we need to read in the light of our own times. In other words, we need to read in the light of climate emergency and mass extinction. And for me, the insights of evolutionary and progressive Christianity have potential in this area. And finally, we need to read in community. We need a shared understanding. And I'm certainly not offering a rounded analysis. I'm led by the Spirit in this. That always needs testing in community. Indeed, if you just take these different perspectives together on reading the Bible, they are not without their own internal tensions. And the dialectic ultimately is within us and between us. So briefly on Ezra as literature, it's historiography using prose narratives. The narratives are drawn on historical records in part, but also partly on memoir. Ezra and Nehemiah were one book in the Hebrew scripture, and part of Nehemiah belongs chronologically and stylistically in Ezra. In addition to that split, the history was further rearranged, redacted for theological purposes, shall we say. The victors or the survivors are the ones who always write the history, and needless to say, it serves their ends and egos. Finally, Ezra is devoid of the prophetic. And I say that because at first sight, that means it's not very promising material to share in a community of prophets like yourselves. So this week's lens is not microscopic. I'm not going to draw on particular verses. It's more of a low Earth orbit, really. I want to look at the broader sweep of history. From what I've said, you'll realize I have to talk a little bit about collapse. There's a huge literature here. Over the years, my research team at the university collaborated with others in examining the phenomena of disaster and collapse. Collapses, like pandemics, are lived forwards and understood backwards. We learn from past collapse. The destruction of Jerusalem and the aftermath is our starting point in Ezra. One conversation we need concerns understanding system collapse more generally. I think that Michael Dowd's understanding is helpful here. He's not your typical prophet of doom. He has humility to recognize that collapse may be near or far, but that readiness for collapse, like readiness for death, displays maturity. And if you've not seen his interviews with Joanna Macy and Gail Wacello and a load of others, I would recommend them. Lots of spiritual food down that road. As Christians, we live in hope. And facing up to collapse doesn't make me a doomist. Christian hope has got little to do with scientific forecasts or economics, but it rests in the promises of God. And in particular, I would cite 2 Peter 3:13, which reminds us that we look forward to a new heaven and a new earth where justice is at home. I know people tend to romanticize and spiritualize this beyond recognition, but I think Jesus was talking about heaven within us and a destination on this earth. So to my questions, some people think it's enough to buy electric cars or plant guerrilla gardens in response to the crisis. Others think it's enough to lock on in Trafalgar Square. But Christian hope imagines that new heaven and earth and does everything required by God on God's terms to work towards it. So my question at the outset of my current obsession stemmed from one thought only, and it was this. Our NVDA is targeted towards undermining the system. But what if the system is already shot? What are our tactics when it starts to fall apart? That grew to the 3 questions in front of you, and as you'll see, I bumped into a lot more questions along the way. So I'm going to start with the book of Ezra itself, and I've created this little timeline. In the handout, I create a potted history, and we don't have time to examine that. It would take best part of an hour on its own. Essentially, the content of Ezra describes the return of the Jews from exile in Babylon and spans about a century. You'd never guess that from reading it. In 538, King Cyrus, creates a client state in Israel and encourages the return of the Jews. The altar of the temple is rebuilt then, but progress is really slow because the people who occupied the land since Israel's deportation really kick off. And the temple is only completed in 515 after another king, Darius, threatens the disruptors with mass executions. Ezra the priest doesn't actually arrive on the scene for another 60 years. He uses imperial authority to establish a theocracy. He's called in the text a scribe. That is someone who the text says studied, lived, and taught the law. He's bigged up in the text with a genealogy of high priests, although he wasn't one, and there's a lot more besides. Ezra famously reads the law in public. It's a marathon teaching session in which the Levites help to interpret in a myriad breakout groups for several hours every day for 7 days. And Melanie insists that I have to finish at midday on Saturday next week. Having re-established the cult, the only tangible social outcome is a denunciation of mixed marriages. Ezra's confession of sin on behalf of Israel turns out to be a nudge for men to divorce foreign wives and abandon their families. Ezra even convenes a citizens' assembly that decides in favor of separating from the people of the land. And then the book finishes with the naming of the families who get sent away. I also want to draw attention to 2 events briefly in Nehemiah. The first is that in chapter 5 of Nehemiah, there's a description of the corruption of the theocracy, which extends to child slavery. Nehemiah challenges the recidivist abuses using imperial power and introduces a reform program. At about the same time, he rebuilds the city walls. That's the second event. And this is a conscious effort to create security and change the status of Jerusalem. So I want to focus on these three circled issues: rebuilding the temple, recovering the law, and rebuilding the city walls. There are some other contemporary issues which I won't have time to cover, but I flagged them in the handout. So those three steps are associated with every great civilizing project, and are more abstractly described as creating space for the sacred, elaborating a vision for flourishing, and the means for defending the new. Now, I think we need conversations about these things. In terms of space for the sacred, things have changed beyond all recognition, of course, since Ezra. Church no longer needs walls. True, it still builds them, but how much of what we need to achieve requires them? When the Spirit lives within, we can give expression to sacred space in many ways in our decentralized networks of giving and receiving. So that's one conversation. Elaborating a vision for flourishing needs to embrace not just the phase where we stand against the system, but also where we move to build its replacement. Now, as CCAs, we've bolted some values onto XRs, and we need to reflect on what the Christian distinctives are for this journey. What do we bring? What will our ethical framework look like? You've all got ideas. What will justice ultimately look like? Fascinating to me is that Roger Hallam recognizes this, even on faith grounds. In his recent film, Pivoting to the End Game, he raises the whole question of virtue ethics. He often talks about the prophetic, but now he's camping out on our lawn. What I don't know is how much he is aware of the work of, say, Catholic ethicist Alistair MacIntyre and the subsequent deliberations of Habermas, Rasmussen, etc., all of which are meat for another discussion. So here's a second conversation. Equally, I think we need to reflect on what we share with other faith traditions. I'd love, personally, FaithBridge to become a place for discussions about wider questions of value and justice. Personally, as I step further out of the ghetto of my spirituality onto the FaithBridge, the first thing I discovered is that I have a closer affinity with people of other faiths than with most Christians. The repercussions for spirituality and understanding of our God that flow from that are profound, and no less so for social organization. In a post-collapse world, how do we defend an emerging alternative while avoiding the cycle of redemptive violence? How do we maintain NVDA as we move into that new world? What does enemy loving look like down the road? For me, these are all big questions needing conversation. Walter Brueggemann points out that in renewal, there is always a dialectic between restoration and novelty, between continuity and discontinuity. For Israel, the experiences of slavery and exile, sandwiched between the flourishing of David and Solomon, pushed them into redefining God's character. Here was a theology that embraces abandonment, death, and restoration, a pattern that Christians know through the abandonment of Jesus to death and his resurrection, and even, if for the most part they ignore it, the final victory of the Lamb. So does our understanding of God's character also require further redefinition? Ezra's strategy seems to lead to an overemphasis on the atavistic, on simply restoring the past. While I follow Ezra in beginning with Scripture, what should our sources be more generally? I wonder if in the attempt to recapture the particulars of Torah, did the returnees forfeit reimagining Torah's essence for their new circumstances? I think there are questions here for us about what we retrieve from the faiths that are associated with the Hebrew Bible. What is it in the people we meet on the faith bridge that is shared? Is there a new move of the Spirit? Is there a new charism? Even, is there an XR spirituality? A renewed discourse is happening. Do we yet know what we want to say in it? I sense in me a longing for a deep ecumenism, as Matthew Fox describes it, which recognizes too the need to hear indigenous peoples who have survived hundreds of years after the defeat of their nations. And it also kicks off in me the recovery or the desire for a recovery of shamanic capacity. I'm really conscious of a challenge, a serious challenge from evolutionary Christianity about the evidence-based for the development of our values. I think Michael Dowd and others ask us, challenge us to take reading the world really seriously. Right, collapse. Although the second law of thermodynamics, entropy of a system, also always increases, everything tends to disorder, is general, every collapse has unique features. One of the ubiquitous outcomes of civilizational collapse is depopulation. In the book of Ezra, the returning Jews count a hugely reduced population, and that persists for the whole century. Among the particulars leading to the collapse of Israel, as the prophets make clear, was the practical moral rejection of the law of Moses, leading to wide-scale abuses of powers, including abuse of the land. These modes were simply re-established by Ezra, whose project results in a failed state. Nehemiah, on the other hand, is a very different proposition, but that's something for another time. In the current emergency, the project of global capital is unraveling. The forces of autarky are represented in isolationist and populist governments, but also within countercultural drives to self-sufficiency and localism. The huge polarities in wealth that we've witnessed in the 20th century have led to massive resource misallocation and the exploitation and abandonment of the global South. The 2008 financial collapse led to increased polarization, as may the response to COVID-19. I would say our situation is typified by moral hazard being endemic. Sovereign debt is a ticking time bomb. Resilience is forgotten. And this misallocation produces a glut of luxury and military goods when humanity requires basic necessities and plowshares. However agile capital has proved to be, its growth trajectory has distinct, defined limits, defined by one Earth. I think the crisis of late capitalism provides tests for the moral strength of traditional church tests that it seems to be failing. And when it comes to justice and trust, I think government and legal systems are enslaved to the domination system. Maybe it's too crude to cast Johnson and Trump as modern Knuts trying to stop the tides coming in, but coming in the tides are. As the system collapses, Ezra provides evidence that people survive. Who knows what fragmented states will emerge and with what value systems? But one thing seems certain, that as global capitalism disintegrates, it will become ever more desperate and more ugly. And we also need to look at the solutions on offer very briefly. Worldly knowledge is one thing, but what response to the climate solutions are out there? I offer you this simple little model. In the blue corner, the domination system sticking up its two fingers to environment and to global warming, supported by parts of the Judeo-Christian tradition. In the green corner, we see what I call domination system soft, the program of sustainable development. Supporting this does not amount to system change, but it does find endorsement among many rebels. In the pink corner, we have resilience models. These do require system change. Citizens' assemblies delegate government to use its power to restrain harmful actors directly. Socially engaged and responsible, the resilience model is countercultural and I would argue livable today. Finally, we have survivalism, which borrows emotionally from resilience, but is autarkic and believes total collapse is locked in. This is a flight response. It could inform new monasticism, and it may be possible to be survivalist in open, generous communities, as opposed to gun-toting isolationism. I just want to draw your attention to the left-right split along that vertical axis. We say we're in favor of system change, but the Green New Deal happens on the terrain of the same means of ownership and control. We need to apply a dialectical understanding to the Build Back Better movement. Yes, this would be preferable to the blue corner, but at the same time, if it were able to realize its program, it will leave the structures of society intact. The wealth polarity, crass materialism, and consumerism, and the related evils all continue. And I ask myself, is this a stage we need to go through? Can humanity afford this drain on the Earth's resources? Never one to miss a provocative. And finally, how do we respond to the book and to the world? How should we act? The economic, social, and political analysis is part of the graft, but our discernment is finally spiritual. Our actions are determined by the rate of collapse and the Spirit's leading in my model. For me, actions for climate justice are still urgent and paramount. But as collapse accelerates, our emphasis should switch from tearing down the existing to building the new. Essentially, the more robust the system, the more we can demand justice within it. The weaker the system, the more we prepare the alternative to it. These are fused. Especially if we are approaching collapse, we need in the present to pray, think, and talk much more about how we prepare to realize God's promises to us. People realize the need of the prophet, not so much the scribe. Ezra the book has something to say to this, at a functional level. So let's remember the role of the scribe. Like prophets, scribes attend to the Lord's leading. They are spirit-filled. They talk in terms of virtues. They codify the ethical framework, and they do this together with the people. They are the minders of the law. They curate and preserve our conversations, and they are communicators. They are also bookkeepers and accountants. So there's a dialectical pull between the need for prophets and the need for scribes. But in good Richard Rohr fashion, I think we need to resolve that they are not an either or, they are a both and. We need them both now. Maybe more prophets now, but the balance will need to change over time. On my reckoning, Ezra ultimately fails. He disappears from Israel's subsequent history. But his role as someone who studied, lived, and taught the law is a useful, if a flawed, model. In my mind, we need more than Ezra.